Plans for a new generation of nuclear power plants have hit obstacles in recent times, with contractors pulling out of projects in Anglesey and Cumbria. But now it emerges that in Suffolk, the government is about to give the go-ahead to the Sizewell C project. The story was broken by our business editor, Simon Jack, who has the details. What's your understanding, Simon?
Hi, Michelle. There are three reasons why I think this looks likely to get the go-ahead. The first is government policy. The government insists it is committed to new nuclear to get to net zero by 2050. And of the 6 sites that were earmarked for new nuclear over a decade ago, 3 of them have collapsed. Only 1 is under construction and 2 are still in the balance. And the government says to get to net zero, we're going to need new nuclear, which means that Sizewell C at the moment is the only realistic game in town. And as I say, even the most ardent environmentalists will confess privately that it's very hard to see how you get to net zero without nuclear. Yes, you can do renewables, and there's something miraculous happened there. They're tumbling down in price, but you have to radically redesign the national grid to get the amount of, for example, offshore wind on the network that you would need. So that's why, if it was just about energy alone, it might not get there. But there is a compelling industrial logic that unions and government both agree: jobs, jobs, jobs. Thousands of high-skilled, high-paid jobs have been created at Hinkley and could be transferred into Suffolk, from Somerset in the west to Suffolk in the east. And that is a compelling argument as far as the government is concerned.
Just briefly, if it gets the go-ahead now, when would it actually be functioning?
Well, these things do take time. If you got the approval now, you would move into a construction phase in the next couple of years. You would then take 9 to 10 years to build it. And environmentalists will tell you that it wouldn't be low carbon or carbon neutral till 2040, only 10 years before the zero carbon target.
Simon Jack, thank you very much. Well, let's explore this key part of the government's thinking, that these plants are needed to meet the target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Emma Pinchbeck is Chief Executive of the Energy Industries Trade Association Energy UK, whose members include the Sizewell contractor EDF. And Tom Burke is the chair of E3G, a think tank which works on climate change. Morning. Welcome to you both.
Morning.
Morning. Tom Burke, what do you think of this decision?
Well, I think Simon's right that it does reflect what the government thinks. But let's be clear, they haven't made a decision. What Simon is doing is reporting on an announcement about a future decision. And when that happened a long time ago with the original station at Sizewell, it was 8 years between the announcement and the decision, and then another 8 years before it produced any electricity. The same with Hinkley. There was 6 years between the announcement that the government wanted to do it and actually making a decision to go ahead. And if the government does go ahead, it will put up electricity consumers' bills, because they'll have to pay twice. They'll have to pay to build the station, and then they'll have to pay again for the more expensive electricity that will be produced by Sizewell, much more expensive than the renewable electricity.
Can I just get your view on this aspect of the government's thinking, that this plant and others like it are needed in order to get to the net zero by 2050 commitment?
No, they aren't needed to do that. There are an enormous number of electricity energy experts who will say we can get there by using renewables and storage, that we don't need it. And as Simon said in his report, it's not going to help us with actually getting to net zero, because net zero by 2050 means we have got to have got fossil fuels out of the power sector by 2040.
Okay, so you think we could have 100% of our power generation through renewables by 2050?
Yeah, I do. So do lots of other people.
Okay. Emma Pinchbeck, what do you think?
So I've worked in the environmental movement, and I worked for the renewables trade body before coming here, and there are very few 100% renewables pathways that don't start to look quite expensive, which isn't to say that it isn't possible. Renewables have been a fantastic success story for the UK, and you won't find a bigger advocate for them than me. But there's about somewhere between 15 and 25% of the mix that we're not sure about yet. And the Committee on Climate Change, the government's advisors on net zero, are recommending a mix of technologies to to deliver on our target, and that will mean renewables predominantly, but also something else. And they've got nuclear in their pathways. They've also got carbon capture and storage. And I think the message is, for me, on nuclear, it's an existing technology and it's here, and we're going to need every single tool in the box to deliver the transformation.
You say it's here, but there's a long road ahead, isn't there? And as Simon was saying, that you wouldn't have a plant like Sizewell C properly coming on stream till, in the midst of the 2030s, close to 2040. Given how much renewables have grown in the last decade, we could be in a completely different landscape by 2040.
Oh yes, and as I used to say in my previous job, you bet the house on renewables. Everyone is very clear that renewables will be dominant in the mix, beyond 2030. It's this question of how we run the system and keep costs of the transition low to consumers for that last bit. And I think the central message on net zero, and you'll hear this from advisors as the year goes on, is that we've only got about 1 to 2 technology cycles to do this. 1 to 2 government administrations in policy. And one of the challenges of delivering net zero is all of the technologies, take a while to come online, but we have to make decisions today. And that again comes back to, we do what we know. And it's the same on the demand side with things like whether we go for hydrogen or for electrification of heat and transport. We go with what we know, and then the other technologies we think may come do anything that we haven't been able to figure out how to do.
Yeah. Tom, I wonder if you can acknowledge the responsibility of the government in having to plan for the scenario where perhaps we can't get to that last bit of the energy mix, that you're still in a position where natural gas perhaps is still needed for power generation, that it needs to do something to provide a zero carbon source of energy that could fill that.
Yeah, I do indeed acknowledge that, but it doesn't mean you have to have nuclear power stations, which will squeeze out the investment you need to meet the challenge that Emma's put about needing to get on with it and get on with it fast. The fact of the matter is, if your policy is to do all of the above, what lobbies will argue for, you end up not doing enough of anything. And so the really important thing is to make the right choices now. And frankly, governments of either party over the whole of this decade are really pretty bad at reading the future and have made a lot of the wrong choices in the past. So we shouldn't have any confidence that they'll get this one right.
And Emma Pinchbeck, supporting the nuclear industry is particularly expensive, isn't it? You have to make it worthwhile for the contractors to do it. And that's part of the reason that those other than EDF have had such grave doubts and pulled out of similar projects.
It's a different kind of infrastructure project, is what I'd say. It's bigger, and the cost of capital is much higher for developing a nuclear plant than it is for other forms of technology. So I think most energy analysts would say comparing different technologies is a bit like apples and pears. What I would say is overall, the low carbon energy system by 2050, and that's with a mix of technologies in it, is expected to be cheaper than one that is run than business as usual today. So even with all of this investment we're needing to do in the system, it's still good news for consumers. And yes, of course, value for money for customers has to be central to thinking.
Emma Pinchbeck from Energy UK, Tom Burke from E3G, the think tank. Thank you.